Nowadays, we take transatlantic air travel for granted. Those lucky enough to fly on Concorde can cross the Atlantic in a mere few hours. But whether we fly business or tourist class, few of us spare much thought for those intrepid aviators who risked life and limb to pioneer air routes across the ocean. Yet it would take nearly 30 years of endeavour to establish a reliable commercial service, years that would witness both triumph and tragedy. It was as long ago as 1910, when the internal combustion engine was still almost a novelty, that the first serious attempt to fly the Atlantic was made. At the time, the airship had much greater range and reliability than the heavier-than-air aircraft. The largest of them were the German Zeppelins. American journalist and explorer Walter Wellman set out from Atlantic City in an airship called America as early as 1910 in an attempt to be the first to fly the Atlantic. Unfortunately, engine problems and severe winds proved too much, and he was forced to ditch in the sea. Luckily, a steamer was on hand to rescue him and his crew. A year earlier, in 1909, Frenchman Louis Blériot had excited Europe, at least, when he became the first man to fly an aircraft across the English Channel. The distance, though, was a mere 32 kilometers. Yet in September 1912, another Frenchman, Fournet, set a new non-stop distance record for aircraft of 1,000 kilometers. The following year, the British newspaper, the Daily Mail, offered a prize of £10,000 for the first non-stop aircraft flight across the Atlantic. This was to be between any point in the British Isles and the United States and Canada, including Newfoundland. This would mean an aircraft having to fly at least 3,200 kilometers, but in 1914 the record stood at just over 1,900. By then, however, war clouds were looming over Europe. Soon the armies were on the march. The guns were to thunder for 4 long years. During the First World War, aviation made great strides forward, especially in terms of aircraft endurance. Zeppelin airships bombed Britain and targets on the Eastern Front. Both sides also developed heavy strategic bombers, like the Italian Caproni, which flew bombing missions over the Alps, and the German Gotha, which joined the Zeppelins in bombing London. Flying boats, too, were used to patrol the seas. They were capable of remaining aloft for several hours. When the fighting finally ended in November 1918 and thoughts turned from war to peace, the Daily Mail declared that its 1913 challenge still stood. 5 years on, however, a non-stop Atlantic crossing was definitely feasible, rather than merely a distant dream. Entries were soon declared, with most electing to fly west to east because of the prevailing winds. But while aircraft were being transported from Britain by sea to Newfoundland, the US Navy stole a march. 4 Curtiss NC-4 flying boats, one captained by Lieutenant Commander Albert Read, took off on the 16th of May 1919 from Trepassey Bay, Newfoundland. Commander Read's aircraft succeeded in landing in the Azores. Read then flew on to Portugal. His was the first Atlantic air crossing, but did not qualify for the Daily Mail prize because of the stop in the Azores. In the meantime, Australian pilot Harry Hawker had taken off in his specially designed Sopwith aircraft Atlantic from Newfoundland on the 18th of May, bound for Ireland. Just after this, Captain F.P. Raynham took off from the same airfield at St. John's, but immediately crashed. Nothing more was heard of Hawker, however, and after 6 days, King George V went so far as to send his wife a telegram of sympathy. In fact, storms and engine problems had forced Hawker to ditch by a Danish steamer, which transferred him to a British destroyer. This brought him back to Scotland. Hawker and his mechanic took the train to London. Here they were acclaimed as heroes, and their salvaged aircraft was displayed on the roof of a department store. Then, on the 14th of June 1919, Captain John Alcock and Lieutenant Arthur Whitten Brown set off, also from Newfoundland, in their modified Vickers Vimy bomber. After a 16 hours flight, they landed in an Irish bog. It had been an epic struggle against fog, dense cloud, sleet and hail. Alcock and Brown had won the Daily Mail prize, and once more London went mad with joy. Not only were they richer by £10,000, but both were knighted by the King for their great feat. Sadly, 6 months after their unique flight, Sir John Alcock was killed in an air crash in France. As befits a British hero, he was buried in Westminster Abbey. In early July 1919, a British airship, the R-34, set out across the Atlantic from Scotland. 4.5 days later, R-34 reached the United States and landed near New York. It made a return trip to Britain a few days later. With its significantly higher payload, the airship appeared to be the commercial airliner of the future, but heavier-than-air transatlantic flights continued. In March 1922, two Portuguese aviators, Cabral and Coutinho, in a Fairey C-3 seaplane, flew from Lisbon by stages to Buenos Aires. Not only was this the first west-east crossing by an aircraft, but also the first ever over the South Atlantic. In 1924, the US Army achieved a spectacular aviation feat. 4 specially designed Douglas World Cruisers took off from Santa Monica, California on the 17th of March. Their aim was nothing less than to fly around the world. Two of the aircraft achieved this, arriving back at Santa Monica towards the end of September. Their journey was done in 57 hops, which included the first flight ever over Greenland. St. Louis businessman Louis Ortegue rekindled interest in transatlantic flights by offering a prize for the first aviator to fly non-stop between Paris and New York. 2 top-scoring French fighter aces of 1914-18 accepted the challenge. The first to try was René Fonck. He took off from New York in September 1926, but crashed before becoming properly airborne. Miraculously, Fonck survived. The following spring it was Charles Nunges's turn. He and co-pilot Charles Colli decided on an east-west crossing and took off from Paris on the 8th of May 1927 in their Lavasseur. After they crossed the coast, nothing more was ever heard of them. "12 days later, and undeterred by the loss of the two Frenchmen, an American, Charles A. Lindbergh, left New York in his Ryan aircraft, named in a reference to Ortegue, the Spirit of St. Louis. "33.5 hours later, he landed at Paris's Le Bourget airport and caused an immediate sensation. Not only had he achieved a long-distance flight record of 5,760 kilometers, but he had done it alone. No wonder that Lindbergh became a worldwide hero. But his flight was only just in time. 2 weeks later, an aircraft took off from New York, bound for Berlin. It did not quite reach the German capital. Nevertheless, Clarence Chamberlain and Charles Levine had comfortably broken Lindbergh's distance record. 1927 was a vintage year for trailblazing flights, and many were made. Commander Richard E. Byrd, later of Polar fame, skippered a Fokker aircraft that inaugurated the first airmail between the United States and Europe at the end of that June. Princess Lowenstein-Wertheim tried to be the first woman to cross the Atlantic by aircraft, flying with 2 experienced male pilots. They were one of a number of crews which were lost over the sea. Americans George Haldeman and Ruth Elder tried, but were to come to grief when their aircraft was forced down, luckily on land, and caught fire. Another American team, including Mrs. Grayson, took off on Christmas Eve 1927 from New York in a Sikorsky amphibian, but like the Princess, vanished somewhere in the Atlantic. It seemed that fate was preventing women from flying across the ocean. This was given further credence in March 1928, when British socialite, the Honourable Elsie Mackay, took off from England in a Stinson Detroiter with the experienced Captain Hinchcliffe as her pilot. They also disappeared. In June 1928, however, the spell was finally broken. American aviatrix Amelia Earhart left Newfoundland with Commander Stultz and Louis Gordon. Nearly 21 hours later, they landed at Barry Port in South Wales. The Welsh gave Amelia in particular a very warm welcome and were fascinated by her. The British media made much of her arrival.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be here in England.
She showed no sign of the strain and fatigue that such a flight must bring, and indeed was happy to joke about the traditional British weather that had greeted her.
I struck rain like this on the way across, so I'm not unaccustomed to this at all. It's rather a pleasure, in fact.
In May 1932, Amelia Earhart took off from Newfoundland again and became the first woman to complete a solo transatlantic flight. She described her landing in Ireland.
I got down without any trouble and taxied to the front door of a surprised farmer's cottage. After receiving a real Irish welcome, I took a Paramount plane to London and there received a real English welcome.
Amelia's ultimate ambition was to fly around the world. She acquired a specially modified Lockheed aircraft for this. She took off in May 1937, but was to vanish in the Pacific. Earhart's British counterpart was Amy Johnson. She married Jim Mollison, who in August 1932 became the first person to fly solo from east to west. The following year, the Mollisons flew together to America, but crashed on landing. Despite this, they entered the record books as the first married couple to fly the Atlantic, with Amy the first woman to do it from east to west. Both were shaken by the crash, but could not escape relentless media attention.
Say something to the folks here.
Yes, I should like the opportunity of thanking everyone here for what they've done for us. No one could have been kinder or more considerate, and it's largely owing to their help that, well, I at any rate am feeling almost myself again. I'm afraid Jim got the worst of it, but you'll be all right in a day or two, won't you?
Well, I would just like to repeat what Amy has told you, that I'm more than grateful to everyone in Bridgeport, and I'm especially glad to be going back to New York again. My only disappointment is that we didn't quite arrive in the way we expected.
New York's welcome of the Mollisons more than made up for the discomfort of their injuries. The first non-stop east-west crossing had in fact been made 4 years earlier, in April 1928. It was achieved by Germans Captain Hermann Kerl and Baron Gunther von Heunefeld, who flew from the Irish Free State in a Junkers monoplane, accompanied by Commandant James Fitzmaurice. It was Fitzmaurice's second attempt to cross the Atlantic. He had tried the previous September with fellow Irishman Captain R.H. Mackintosh. Unfortunately, their aircraft came down before it left Ireland. Those who were forced down in the sea were, however, sometimes lucky enough to be rescued. In August 1924, Italian Lieutenant Locatelli put his flying boat down in the Atlantic, but was unable to get airborne again. His aircraft caught fire, but a vessel was at hand to rescue him and his crew. The Dornier flying boat, piloted by Captain F.T. Courtney, suffered a similar fate 4 years later. The rescue was filmed by an amateur cameraman and gave added interest for the passengers on board the liner, which saved the crew. There were some bizarre Atlantic crossings. In June 1929, a French aircraft called Yellow Bird challenged the American Green Flash to a straight race across the ocean. The latter took off first from a beach near New York, but was impeded by the waves. Now it was the French aircraft's turn. Yellow Bird landed at Santander in Spain before flying on to Paris. After Yellow Bird arrived there, the crew discovered a stowaway on board in the form of an American teenager. Italian military airman Italo Balbo was a believer in the spectacular. In January 1931, he led 12 Savoia Marchetti flying boats on a flight from Rome by stages to Brazil. Two and a half years later, he capped this in even more spectacular fashion. This time, no less than 24 flying boats flew from Ireland via Iceland and Greenland to Montreal in Canada. They then returned to Europe via the Azores. Mussolini rewarded Balbo handsomely. 2 Italians had also broken the non-stop distance record in July 1928. Major Del Prete and Captain Ferranin flew from Rome to Brazil 7,200 kilometers in all. But in 1931, Americans John Polando and Russell Boardman flew New York to Constantinople.
Well, we got some sandwiches and 2 roast chickens. Well, I hope we have one of those chickens left when we reach Turkey.
This lasted them some 8,000 kilometers. By the early 1930s, regular passenger flights were becoming widespread. In 1933, the US airline Pan American commissioned Lindbergh to carry out 2 transatlantic crossings over Greenland and the Azores to survey a feasible aircraft route. But the way had already been pioneered in 1931 and 1932 by a giant German Dornier DOX passenger flying boat which made successful Atlantic flights. It carried passengers on both trips and caused a sensation when it landed in New York Harbor. The first Atlantic passenger flights had actually begun in October 1928. The German Graf Zeppelin airship made a successful 10,400-kilometer flight from Lake Constance near the Swiss border direct to Lakehurst, New Jersey. Graf Zeppelin had 20 fare-paying passengers on board. They enjoyed much greater comfort than in the Dornier flying boat. The following year, the Graf Zeppelin made a round-the-world trip. This seemed to confirm that the airship could provide a much more reliable and luxurious means of long-distance air travel than the aeroplane. However, the 1929 Wall Street stock market crash halted further progress until Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933. He saw that the Zeppelins could be used for Nazi propaganda. Accordingly, in 1936, a regular transatlantic passenger service was established. But this was to be tragically short-lived. On the 6th of May 1937, the Hindenburg came to grief while landing at Lakehurst. In the meantime, Pan American and its British equivalent, Imperial Airways, had become convinced that the flying boat was the answer. By summer 1939, both airlines had established a regular service across the Atlantic. War, however, now intervened once more when the German Blitzkrieg burst upon Poland. Yet throughout the Second World War, the transatlantic service was maintained. As such, it was to provide the foundation of today's numerous air routes between the Americas and Europe. But the vintage years for Atlantic flights were from 1919 to 1934. During this time, 86 attempts were made, of which over half were successful. Pride of place, though, must go to Sir John Alcock and Sir Arthur Whitten Brown, who made that very first non-stop crossing in their open cockpit Vickers Vimy.